Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC. We're delighted to be joined today by our first guest from the Philippines, and it's a very distinguished one. Monalisa Dimalanta, Chairperson of the Energy Regulatory Commission, the ERC of the Philippines. Prior to this role, she was a partner at PJS Law, as well as a professor at Ateneo de Manila Law School, and also spent time at AboitizPower as Chief of Legal. Mona, welcome to Energy Unplugged. Delighted you can join us.
Thank you. Thank you, Hugo, for inviting me over, and thank you for having the Philippines Energy Regulatory Commission on your show.
We're also joined today by John Feddersen, Aurora's founder and CEO. John, thanks for joining as well.
Thanks for having me, Hugo, and really looking forward to this conversation with Monalisa.
Terrific. So for our listeners who are perhaps slightly less familiar with energy trends in the Philippines, Mona, can you perhaps give us a kind of state of the nation? And we might break this down under a few topics. Could you just give us a little bit of background of the history of Philippines' electricity system and just the basics of the market design? It has a wholesale market. It's looking at a capacity market, those kind of things. So listeners know what we're getting into.
All right, some history lesson. We go as far back as the 1930s if we talk about the power system in the Philippines, because our power system was really built on not many people know about this, but our power system was really built on the bedrock of renewables. That's what I keep saying even when I was still chair of the National Renewable Energy Board in 2019 to 2021. When the National Power Corporation, that's our state-owned power company, was formed in 1930, its mandate was to explore hydropower resources in the Philippines. And that was really the intention, to power the islands with hydropower resources, which makes absolute sense because we're a group of islands surrounded by water. So the idea was to nurture, enhance, and build on this, on this bounty that we find ourselves in. This mandate was expanded sometime in the 1970s to explore also geothermal resources, again, which makes more sense for us being in this Pacific Ring of Fire. So for many decades, our country was powered by hydropower resources and geothermal resources. That's why I think up until 2019, we were second in the world for production of geothermal power, where we lost to Indonesia, I think, sometime in 2020, but we were second to the US for many decades. So this changed when I think the government opened up the sector to private sector participation, because initially it was all government funded. When it was open to private participation sometime in the 1980s all the way to the late 1990s, that's when coal and petroleum-powered facilities were introduced to the system. And then the turning point, I think, was in 2001 when the sector was deregulated, when the generation sector was deregulated, and it was really purely private funding that has really built the expansion of capacities in the country. Today, the system is predominantly coal-based, with a significant portion of natural gas coming from our indigenous resource. We have one very significant natural gas find in the Philippines, and it powers about 30% of our system. And then the rest of coal covers about 50% of our capacity. And then the rest is what we call the legacy RE and the new renewables that have come in after 2008, when the renewable energy law was passed in the country to jumpstart again our sort of a reversion, not a transition for the Philippines, a reversion to renewable energy based systems, and that's where we find ourselves in today. We have a coal moratorium that's in place since 2020, so no additional coal plants are being built in the country, and we are really jumpstarting again our utilization of renewables in the system.
And in terms of the market structure, from memory, I think the wholesale market kicked off in 2006, somewhere around there. Maybe a little bit of detail about that, the actual kind of structure of the market and how it's organized.
Actually, the market system follows what I mentioned earlier, the turning point in 2001, when the market was when the generation sector was deregulated. It became a competitive sector, and then our used to be vertically integrated system now is significantly privatized, with the generation sector purely privatized. The transmission sector, the assets are still owned by a government corporation, but the operations is via a concessionaire. And then we have retail market also already in place in the system, where large customers can contract directly with their own suppliers. Then all these things are factored into our wholesale electricity spot market, which is a gross pool market. So everything is offered to the market. All capacity in the system is required to be offered to the market. And then the market is the one that sets the merit order dispatch and issues the instructions to the system operator. And the market, we now have a 5-minute market. So trading happens every 5 minutes, every day, every single day, unless there is the only exceptions would be if there is a typhoon that really affects a significant portion of the market, then we declare some market intervention there. But those are really not a commonplace. So we have a fully functioning market where all traders we set, of course, there's a market price that is reported on a regular basis and sends hopefully the proper signals to all investors and players so that we get all this interest in place.
I find it interesting, sort of the motivation to liberalize, Mona. For example, we had Pat Wood on, who was the chair of FERC, and he pushed a lot of the liberalization of the US markets. But of course, he only got 60% of the way there, and it never happened in 40% of the US. Can you say a little bit about the motivation for a country like the Philippines? What was the hope, or what was the intention of liberalizing the power market at the time?
Okay, I think there were two significant drivers there. The first was it really wasn't sustainable anymore for government to keep funding the growth of the sector. At the time that that 2001 law was passed, National Power Corporation, which is a state-owned company, was already riddled with debt. And it was responsible for like 1/3 of the country's debt. So that was clearly, an issue that needed to be addressed. The second motivation was there was a wave of, if you recall, around that time, and I'm sure we're all alive already in 2001, there was some sort of wave of privatization that was really going on around the world. And I think the Philippines was not spared of that wave. And there were a lot of benefits that was seen from privatization, including increased competition, which could drive down, the idea was to drive down prices with competition. So two things, save government in a way from that continuous burden of subsidizing power, and then introduce competition to really lower the prices.
I think there's probably two other things that are quite unique to the Philippines. I mean, one, and from memory, it's something like 2,000 inhabited islands amongst 7,000 plus. So real grid challenges, but also, really rapid growth in demand. I think the population of Philippines is something around 120 million people. Per capita electricity use is low, but growing quickly. They're two quite unique features, I think, of the system, and do make the transition more challenging.
Mhm. You're absolutely right. It's quite unique. Although we are not the only archipelago, not even in the region, right? We look at Indonesia, which is also an archipelago, but admittedly with larger land mass than the Philippines. We also have Japan, which is also, a group of islands. Which I guess the differentiator there would be in terms of economic ability. Japan would have more capacity to invest in its own resources. So we have a unique set of conditions, I think, in the Philippines. But I think the opportunities overwhelm the challenges, I think, especially with newer technologies being smaller in scale. I think that's where our opportunity lies. That it's challenging to connect all 7,600 islands in one grid. But right now the three main islands are connected already physically, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And that's where the load centers are in those three large islands. The smaller islands, there are plans to connect some of the larger, smaller islands where there's really significant economic activity, and it would make sense. It would be viable to connect these islands physically. But for some of the islands that are mainly residential, with residential customers, some economic activity, but not quite. Maybe resorts can be are located in those islands. Dive spots are located in those islands. That's where renewable energy facilities can really make a difference, because these are smaller in scale, where sunlight abounds and water surrounds them. And it's really the challenge, I think, is how to creating, designing that model of a project that fits into the circumstances of these islands. So there are challenges, but I think there are more opportunities given what we have in the country.
Totally agree. Before we get on to kind of regulation in the Philippines, then it would also be great to just get you to touch on some of the recent policy announcements. So the Philippine Energy Plan, I think the target is 35% renewable energy generation by 2030 and 50% by 2040. So, reasonably aggressive goals from where we are today. And that's backed in particular by a green energy auction program. So regular auctions to provide stable revenues for renewables and bring on something like 11 to 12 gigawatts over the next short to medium term, as well as renewable portfolio standards for retailers. Could you talk a little bit about the ambition here and what impact that's having on the market in the Philippines?
Yep. Okay. The ambition is really quite new. When I was chairing the National Renewable Energy Board in 2019, that renewable portfolio standard, which is a quota, a minimum that all utilities and retailers must source from renewables as part of their portfolio. That number was just 1% of their total portfolio. And then we worked towards getting that number to get us to 35% RE by 2030, because that has been what was called the aspirational target back in 2010. But when we checked the data, when we reviewed how we were going in terms of are we getting closer to 35% by 2030, what we found out was that from the time the Renewable Energy Act was passed in 2008, when the system was already 34% powered by renewables in 2008, we were at 19% to 20% in 2019. So it was really counterintuitive that with the Renewable Energy Act, instead of increasing the utilization of RE, it even went down significantly. So, the advocacy then, and NREB, the National Renewable Energy Board, was really a research arm, an advocacy arm for the Department of Energy. We really advocated that this aspiration become an imperative. And with that, we used, science-based approach. We had our own modeling, our own cost assumptions put into that model, and we worked back. what will it take to get to 35% by 2030, knowing where we are today? And what resulted was we need to increase that renewable portfolio standard of 1% to 2.52% starting 2023. And it's good that, the Department of Energy adopted our recommendations. And now that RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, that quota now stands at 2.52%. And that assures that we will get to 35% by 2030. But that's on the demand side. How do we make sure that the supply is there to get us to that 35%? And that's where the green energy auction comes in. The Department of Energy holds so far annual auctions. And I think for this year, they'll be holding two, because there was one that was already concluded sometime July of this year. Then another one is slated for November for geothermal and hydropower capacity. So these two components go hand in hand. On the demand side, we make sure that there is a minimum demand to get us to that imperative of 35% by 2030, and then 50% by 2030. And on the supply side, the auction ensures a steady stream of supply, of new capacity that is being built to meet that demand.
Right. And is that an argument, Mona, for, you talked about the portfolio standards being at 1%, which presumably didn't bite, in the sense that there were enough renewables there in the system that the cost of compliance was very low. Mm-hmm. But I do, in some jurisdictions, I see, people want to introduce a carbon price, or they want to introduce, auctions for green power, and the debate kind of but they're saying, let the best be the enemy of the good, in the sense that I think there'll be some who will say, well, if we can get the policy set up, even if it's not powerful, even if it's a $5 carbon price or a $10 carbon price, it's something we can build from. Whereas the argument says, well, if we don't do it properly, let's not do it at all, because we miss our shot. Do you think having that, even if it wasn't a very ambitious policy, do you think having that policy in place and pre-existing enabled you to move faster when the public will was there?
Definitely, because all investors, and no exception, all investors were saying back in 2019, when the policy was still at 1% and the 35% was still called an aspiration, all the investors were saying, send us the signals. Where are we going? So I think there was a twin movement that happened. First, the declaration of the coal moratorium in 2020. So that's a clear signal that, okay, the Department of Energy will not license any more new or greenfield coal plants, at least in I think the horizon set there was 2025, that they will not license new coal plants. And then the second is really the RPS, because it's sort of hard coded into our planning, into our Philippine energy plan, that aspiration. And then it became, as I mentioned earlier, it became an imperative. The conversation turned from, is it nice to get there, to how do we get there? Yeah. So that was really, I think those two developments were really key in getting us to where we are today.
Right. So looking forward, so you've got the portfolio standards, you've got the green auctions, you're closing the coal, and that's giving investors the confidence to build. Is that it? Is it mission accomplished? This is going to do the job, or what are the next challenges on the horizon that you see, Mona?
Yeah, I think there are several more challenges that we need to confront. And one immediate challenge, and I think we're not alone in this one. I think we see it in other jurisdictions as well, is how will the grid cope with this with this onslaught, if I may put it that way, with this onslaught of new renewable projects sprouting all over the country. So I think that's the number one challenge. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have a private concessionaire operating our grid. And I think for the most part of the decade, they were used to, of the previous decade, they were used to applications for grid connections that were maybe 10 a quarter, 20 in a year. But now you have in the auctions, the DOE announcing 30, 50 winners of, 30 projects, 50 projects awarded per auction. Now they have, a deluge of applications, and, determining what will be the impact of all these renewables, intermittent, most of them, in the grid. And, how do they make the space? That's just on processing of applications, but in terms of ensuring system stability, that's also quite challenging. How do they make sure the grid remains stable with all these renewables coming in? So I think that's in a very, very near horizon. We need to address that point. And I think the what remains to be, apart from that, moving on from that would be the entry of large scale renewables. I mentioned earlier, the Department of Energy will conduct an auction for geothermal and hydro. This is like, traveling back in time, where in the 1930s and 1970s, as I mentioned earlier, we were really building pump storage hydro and large geothermal plants. And the desire is to, introduce again these large projects, not only for the branding of green, but really because the system needs them. The system needs the stabilizing feature of these projects, and we need to do it sooner rather than later, considering that these projects take a longer gestation time compared to solar and wind. So that's, I think, just few of the challenges that we need to address in the very near term.
Right. Yeah, and I'd like to touch briefly on your comment about needing to do it sooner rather than later. But just one observation. It's so interesting. Aurora's in a bunch of different countries operating, and just this pattern recognition about you can almost predict what the problems will be at a certain point in time. How do we connect everything to the grid? Philippines is not alone in having this challenge of enormous amounts of capital that want to come in and build projects, but a grid that doesn't necessarily handle the renewables peak so much. So and then obviously system stability and how you solve that with markets and with technology is a big one. So just an observation really that it's, I think probably if you went back 50 years, the problems were all very different. There was there was France building a nuclear fleet, the Philippines with legacy geothermal and hydropower. These things were all very different and very much local creations around the political system. Whereas now I think a lot of these problems are converging, which I suppose good in a way. There's economies of scale in problem solving.
But makes problem solving very challenging also, I think. Because as I think in different venues I've talked about this, that there are multiple transitions going on. It's not just a transition from high carbon to low carbon systems. It's a transmission also from a highly centralized to a decentralized system. It's a transition of high energy intensity to low energy intensity system, and they're all happening at the same time. So it's quite a challenge to be navigating in this space at this point in time.
But very exciting too, I think.
Very exciting. Yes, very exciting.
So on the sooner or later bit, I have this famous. I remember back to an Aurora conference maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and the Alex Chisholm, who was in charge of the Government Department of Energy in the UK, he got up in front of everyone and he said, "Hey, industry, you're always telling me what I'm getting wrong and how you need to change things. And then when I change things, you're telling me it's hitting the cost of capital and I just need to leave things stable." And I think that's not, I've heard that sort of framing from regulators, from policymakers around the world in a lot of contexts. You just said in terms of sort of the large scale renewables, it's better to move sooner rather than later. Obviously, it's going to depend on the problem. But how do you think philosophically about the place of the regulator? Are you, is it? I suppose my take is sort of, I don't mind a regulator being a little bit slow. I don't want a regulator guessing at what the future will look like. Respond to the problem. Don't try to forecast the problem, because that's hard to do. But how do you And then there are obviously different instances, with electric vehicle rollout. Sometimes you need the charging infrastructure before the vehicles come and those types of things. But like philosophically, how do you think about the regulator's role? Are you happy to be reactive, or are you thinking you need to be a proactive, change driver in the Philippines?
I think for the Philippine context, given that we're a developing economy, I think we need to be both. We need to be proactive and reactive as well. And more if given all the resources that we can possibly have, more proactive than reactive. I think we need to recognize that we have a key role, we have a key contribution to progress in the country. I think it would have been different if I were a regulator in a developed country, in what they call the first world, and I say quote unquote first world country. I think I would take it would be a different mindset. But in a developing nation, all hands on deck. All players need to play a role, need to contribute to moving us forward, and that's where I think, at least on my, you asked me about my personal philosophy on regulation, and that's I think where I stand. I think we need to make sure we contribute to progress and we don't stand in the way of progress. But at the same time, and that's why I say reactive as well, recognizing if there is something that needs to be fixed, like if a regulation that we thought would work well does not work well for various reasons, we need to be able to pull back and say, let's change course, let's shift course, and let's do it differently, so that we protect also the interests of the consumers.
Interesting. And a sort of related one, and I get that, and I think I see that a little bit, in the different markets Aurora operates. I do think it's a bit more of a collaborative endeavor, I suppose in sort of where liberalization of the markets has happened less quickly, where you haven't spent the last couple of decades building up these sometimes adversarial institutions that often know exactly what their turf is and what their turf isn't. You do get a more collaborative sort of approach, and I think that sometimes works better. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of your career and the way you go about things, Mona. And the first thing is sort of, people won't know, a lot of our listeners won't know this, but you're a bit of a celebrity in the Philippines. You do a lot of media appearances.
No,
you do that. Maybe I'm overstating it. It's hard to know the media context, but you're a well-known person. And is there a risk in being too prominent? Again, and maybe it's sort of the European context, but it's sort of, you make yourself a target, right? And to some extent you want a kind of boring regulator being a goalkeeper.
Yes.
It's like being a goalkeeper in football. It's like, if people notice you, then something's going wrong here. So how do you think about your role and your public prominence?
Absolutely agree. My goal is to be a boring regulator. That's really the goal, because that means that everything is running smoothly, right? People don't need to see the regulator or have the regulator explain certain things, because things are working as they should. So that's why that's my goal. But admittedly, because, I think there's also some cultural context to it. In the Philippines, if you're in government, you're somehow a celebrity.
Okay.
So because you get interviewed by media, you get included in the events of certain the really high profile politicians. So that's I think where it's coming from. But again, we were talking about philosophies earlier on regulation. My philosophy on leadership is, if I am put in this position, and if there are these, I might say, I don't seek certain trappings of the position. But if it's part of the position, then I might as well use it to advance the purpose of the agency. So all those media interviews, it's to explain what's happening in the sector. It's to explain how this energy market works, just as what we're doing now. I embrace them as opportunities to level up the discussion, level up the conversation in in this platform, in more local platforms, like I take radio interviews at 5 a.m. If because radio has really a wider reach, it's still in the Philippines, especially in the countrysides. So if it takes me to wake up at 4:30 a.m. and explain at 5 a.m. in the radio why we decided certain cases the way that we did, then that's the job. That's really how I think about it.
Just to follow up, I mean, we're all kind of deep energy wonks, and
Yes.
can talk about the grid, but I think one of the challenges with energy is, one, it's become very politically sensitive. As you say, there are multiple transitions happening simultaneously. And so, politicians in every country want to comment on it, but it's increasingly a vote winning or losing issue. But at the same time, it's getting more complicated, right? There's more technologies. Different countries are taking different paths to decarbonization, although there are commonalities. When you're commenting publicly, I mean, I suppose the fundamental answer is it's just difficult. Like, how do you convey that this is hard, but there are opportunities, but we're going to have to spend some money? Like, what's your theory on communicating difficult energy concepts to the public?
I think it works that so I'm a lawyer, but my undergraduate degree, my pre-law degree, was communications. So it helps a lot that there are concepts that were purely theoretical before that I get to practice today. One is make it get it as close to home as possible. Whenever, as I mentioned earlier, for example, those radio interviews, I have to translate to, for example, how many kilos of rice will this translate to? Will this rate translate to? We had one of the more difficult cases that we decided last year was when we denied a claim for price adjustment by a utility, and we had to explain in public why we denied that price adjustment, because the utility was saying, no, just grant us this price adjustment because it will be better in the long run. So we had to explain why it wasn't better in the long run. And in order to translate that, because if we talk about pesos per kilowatt hour, for example, it's very hard for ordinary folks, right, to grasp that idea. But if you translate that into kilos of rice that would have been bought by that pesos per kilowatt hour if we had granted the petition, then it's then you almost hear the aha on the other side of the radio set, where people then realize that's what it means. So it's translating it to the everyday stuff that people can relate to. It depends on the audience, of course. If it's a different audience that has a different medium in terms of understanding, then you translate it to what's common to them. Like I teach also I used to teach. I had to stop because of the workload now, but I used to teach in the law school. So if you translate it to grades, for example, because students appreciate that, and just translate it to something that they get to, that wouldn't be difficult for them to get the concept of.
For what it's worth, I mean, it feels like it's impossible for politicians to debate these topics. The level of debate is, at least in Europe, in North America, is the target 40% by 2035? Is it 50% by 2032? And you're kind of trying to position yourself on years, and in general, decarbonization is bipartisan in a lot of the OECD, at least, and so you're sort of competing on this. And I think over the last decade, we got to the point where we get these very farcical targets that will never be achieved, but no one ever kind of checked out whether they made any sense or not, right? And I see that on both sides of the Atlantic. And so I think there is this vacuum or this open space for a great communicator who's not a politician, who can add a level of detail. Or no, it's why we're so lucky to have guys like Simon Evans, Hugo at Carbon Brief, or Jesse Jenkins in the US, or Guy New in the UK, who are great communicators who are prepared to go a level slightly below. Most people don't listen to them because people don't engage with that. But I think these are definitely policy shaping views. So I think it's wonderful in general that there are people who publicly get into the detail. We try to do it on this podcast a bit as well.
Mm-hmm.
I had one more. I had one more, Hugo, if I may, just on your career mode. I like talking about our guests' careers, but you've had this super varied career: academia, public service, trade organizations. Now you're running the regulator. I think increasingly people are specializing in the world, in all sorts of fields. There's no more, polymaths in academia, and there's no more sort of journey people in their careers. Do you think that's an advantage, having had that diverse background? You talked about your communications degree, but in what ways do you see that diversity as a benefit in your career right now? Would you have been better off just being a regulator for your whole career since graduation?
Oh God, I don't want to be a regulator for my entire life.
There's a burnout that happens at some point, I suspect. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the way I view it is I use whatever I have to do a better job. So my background is admittedly diverse. But I think it's an advantage because I turn it into an advantage. So I build with what I currently have. If it were otherwise, for example, if I had my first job out of law school was in a law firm, but that was short lived. I went to the Supreme Court. I actually clerked for a justice, and it was good. I love law clerk work. And I'm thinking now, if I had stayed there all my life and then became a regulator, would that have been an advantage also? I think it would have been an advantage also, because the variety, the diversity of cases that a justice has to study and has to rule upon also brings about certain wisdom, right? And a wealth of experience as well. Admittedly, a bit maybe two steps far from where the action takes place, but it's also good. So I think ultimately it's a mindset. If you're one to desire certain things before you do something, before you feel like, okay, I'm ready to do this, then that's your formula. My formula has always been, I'll use what I have and I'll do a better job using what's given me, the cards that I'm dealt with. So,
well, I feel even after this brief conversation, you'd have been a terrific law lecturer. I did an undergrad degree at law, but was not a star student. I could have definitely done with a few more lecturers like you along the journey.
It's fun. I like teaching, actually. So. Yep.
And Hugo he's self-deprecating here. I think he has a first in law from Melbourne Law School, which is not an easy thing to do. I dropped out of law after a year or so of law school. So Hugo, you were a god at Melbourne Law School in my book.
I was tempted to drop out after my first year. Law school is hard.
It is.
But I'm glad I pushed through. So.
We wanted to get a couple of rapid fire questions here at the end, and I try and ask these on every pod that I host. What's one out of consensus view that you think you have on the energy transition as a whole? So I suppose we're asking you to calibrate your views against conventional wisdom on a topic.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if this is out of consensus, but definitely when I talk about this, even in a room full of politicians, they get, you're treading on dangerous ground. So maybe it is out of consensus, but I like talking about energy democracy. And I think one of it's not usually spoken about when we talk about transition, but I think it's one of the fruits of the transition that we have increasingly as a higher level of democracy participation in the energy space, more than what we have seen in the last maybe 10, 20 years. It's partly because of technology. Technology enables the advent of what we call the prosumer market. But I think it's more than technology. It's a mindset that people can actually choose. And it's quite liberating when people know, I can choose to be supplied by renewables, right? So before it was, we're all passive. We're all just recipients of whatever our utilities deliver to us. But now there is that ability to demand. I demand that, I, of course, electrons are not colored, but I demand green electrons to be flowing in my house, or I will build my own. I will set up my own solar facility because I want to know that, what powers my house is not impacting adversely on the environment. So there are those fruits of the transition, I think, that we will see. I hope still in my lifetime, but we will see them, being the norm. I think in the future. So, and that entire package, I think is energy democracy to my mind. So.
And then one final question. Who do you read or listen to in the energy space that you think is always good and thought-provoking and kind of relevant to you as a regulator?
Mm-hmm. I read, I listen a lot. I love podcasts, especially during weekends when I'm, doing chores in the house and it's just sort of white noise, but I'm still absorbing all those things. But I listen to a lot on the energy space. But if I may diverge a little, I think what enriches my practice, what enriches my being a regulator is listening to non-energy speakers, because it gives me a different perspectives on things, like speakers on leadership, speakers on the workspace, on AI and digitization and digital, this new phenomenon that we find ourselves in. That's where I really deliberately seek speakers and books and podcasts in that space, like people like podcasts by Adam Grant, James Clear, Arthur Brooks, and the like. So people that just in a generic space just challenges your thinking, I think.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I'm very bad. I think I subscribe to something like 30 energy podcasts now, and it's almost like buying the Weekly Economist. Like, I don't even get a quarter of the way through, and then this accumulated guilt builds up because I can never. So I certainly need to diversify my podcast listening, and that sounds like a few great suggestions. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. As I said, the first guest from the Philippines on the pod. I think we're 160 episodes in, and we couldn't have asked for a better one. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time as well, and thanks for the challenging questions. I like hearing from different jurisdictions. I like hearing from different ways of thinking. So thank you.
And John, thanks for joining us too.
No, thanks for having me. What a conversation, and thanks for me, Mona, as well.
That was Monalisa Dimalanta, Chairperson of the Energy Regulatory Commission of the Philippines, talking to Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC, and John Feddersen, Founder and CEO of Aurora. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.